Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. In this video, we're going to be talking about Scream 3. Let's get into it. Scream 3 is a 2000 horror film starring Neve Campbell, David Arquette, Courtney Cox, and is directed by Wes Craven.
What do you know about trilogies?
Well, all I know about movie trilogies is that in the third one, all bets are off.
Here it is, folks, the redheaded stepchild of this franchise. It seems like every long-running franchise has that one movie whose reputation basically transcends the actual movie itself. And people tend to just hate on that movie because it becomes sort of trendy or socially acceptable to hate on it. And then people get on the internet and jump on the bandwagon of hate because they feel like if they admit that they actually like this movie, it somehow hurts their credibility as a lover of that franchise or even movies in general. But like I said, I'm not trying to say this is an absolute fact, and I'm definitely not trying to insult anybody who really genuinely doesn't like this movie. This is just my opinion based on my own perceptions. I see a lot of the hate this movie gets online, and it actually makes me laugh sometimes. Because is it a perfect movie? Obviously not. But I feel like Scream fans should at least be proud of the fact that this was the lowest point their franchise has ever gotten. I've addressed this in some other videos of mine, but seriously, look at Hellraiser, or Wrong Turn, or Child's Play, or even some of the Nightmare and Friday movies. Hell, even look at Halloween. At least you don't have Busta Rhymes roundhouse kicking Ghostface or smacking him in the face. And honestly, I would say Scream probably lends itself to that sort of humor better than just about any of those other franchises except Chucky, seeing as how it's already sort of a dark comedy. But nope, it still never dipped that low. It still maintained integrity. I would say this movie is definitely the most experimental out of the 5 movies we've gotten so far. But I don't know that that's entirely a bad thing. In fact, if I had to really dock this movie for anything, it would be just how censored it was. And I'll get into that more a little later. But even with that being said, I think the movie we got was still pretty solid. And for me personally, not even the worst in this franchise. If you've been keeping up with my videos on this franchise and paid attention to what I've said, you can probably figure out on your own which movie is my least favorite. But I will be doing a ranking of all 5 movies whenever I get done reviewing them, so stay tuned for that. And I'll probably lose some subscribers when I drop that video. But anyways, getting into my positives, and the first really big positive I have for this movie is that it had the guts to break formula and go its own direction. Scream 2 stayed true to that formula to the point of actually feeling very uninspired and unoriginal to me. You can see my full thoughts on that movie in my Scream 2 review, but this movie said, no sir, we're going to do something totally different. And I would say it also dove quite a bit deeper into the meta side of things. Probably more than any other movie in this franchise. We had our main characters interacting with the cast of the Stab movies within this movie, and I thought most of those scenes were actually very fun. Some of them were a little too campy, even for my liking, but most of the time they were done pretty well. And it was one of the better aspects of this movie, if you ask me, especially with Jennifer Jolie, played by Parker Posey. A lot of people think she was annoying, but I actually thought her character was a good little yin to Courtney Cox's yang. The contrast between their two characters and how they bounced off each other and interacted was actually pretty hilarious, and like I said, one of the better aspects of this movie. Another thing I really enjoyed was how they introduced Randy into this movie. Now, as far as the logic of it, it did seem a little forced when you really think about how it was executed. And when you go back and look at Scream 2, and you're like, okay, when could he have possibly done that? But they didn't spend a lot of time on it, and they still allowed Randy to be the exposition character in this movie and the person laying out all the rules, and I think it was still pretty clever. They also introduced Martha Minx, and who would have known that all these years later that would have actually gave us an organic and natural avenue to bring in Randy's niece and nephew, the twins from Part 5. In hindsight, that's actually a pretty good creative choice. They obviously didn't know that when they were making this movie, but, you know, things work out. But I even liked the way we went back to the past and fleshed out the character of Maureen Prescott a little bit more. We learned a little bit more about who she was. Sure, they answered a bunch of questions that I wasn't really asking, but at least they gave me answers that I could live with. They added more layers to these characters that I think was a pleasant little surprise, and it didn't ruin anything that had been established previously in the other two movies, so I did like that. And another aspect of this film I really enjoyed was the third act of this movie. I felt like it was the most intense of probably any other third act in any of these movies, with the exception of maybe part 4. And spoiler warning, I actually thought the way they introduced Roman as Sydney's brother and the whole story behind it was actually pretty solid and a creative little retcon. Let's face it, you can only come up with so many reasons why these different killers are continuously coming after the same person, and it can come off as feeling a little forced or contrived. So I think the revelation that they're siblings was actually a pretty good one. Retcons can be very bad, though, and can ruin a movie, especially if you're retconning a very beloved film like Scream. But I feel like what they did here was pretty creative, and I've seen some people say that it hurt Billy's character from the first movie because it made him seem like less of a mastermind himself and more of a puppet. But I never really looked at it like that. Roman just showed Billy the footage of his dad and Maureen. Billy was already angry, and basically this just gave him the fuel he needed, but Billy is still the one who orchestrated everything in that first film. If anything, Stu is the only puppet, which is why I have such a hard time digesting those theories that Stu has been behind the scenes of everything since part 3, pulling the strings of anything. I just really don't subscribe to that logic. I'm sorry, guys. I don't. But getting back on track here, I do like how badass the third act conflict is between Sydney and Roman here. You can tell by this point Sydney has just had enough, and she is actually going toe-to-toe with this dude like a man. This movie has officially cemented her, in my eyes, as arguably the best final girl in slasher history. She's always been a fighter since the first movie, and a little more intuitive than a lot of the other final girls, but her character is fully realized in this movie, and even though her screen time in this movie is pretty limited, her utilization was spot on, which is another thing I like. This movie doesn't spend a lot of time putting the actual character of Sydney front and center, but her presence is all over this film. And throughout this entire movie, you can feel the intensity rising as it's leading up to the inevitable final battle between her and Ghostface, because he is searching for her through this whole movie, and she's coming to the realization that she just can't keep running. And when we finally do get there, it was, for the most part, very satisfying for me. I do have some issues with the third act, and that actually moves me right into my cons. So as much as I did enjoy the third act execution of this movie, I do have issues with it, and it's not necessarily with the third act itself. In fact, if I could make any changes to this movie, I would leave the third act exactly the same and just make some tweaks with the first 2 acts. Because as clever as the sibling revelation was, I don't think there was proper build-up to it in this movie, and I just don't feel like it was earned. In fact, when he's unmasked, Sydney looks just as confused as the audience. There was no shock value whatsoever because we really didn't care about this character, because they didn't flesh him out really at all in this movie. In fact, if I remember correctly, there's not a single scene with Sydney and him interacting with each other prior to the third act. And it's not like he had to hide from her. She had no idea who he was or that she even had a brother. I'm not sure if there were other scenes involving him and her together, or maybe even just him that just didn't make it into the movie, but even as a kid watching this, that unmasking reveal just didn't have the same effect on me as some of the others in this franchise. I still enjoyed it better than the second movie, but still pretty weak. But from the moment he's unmasked, I love everything else right up until the end. But that is something that took me out of the scene a bit, so I had to mention it. My next negative is actually a 2-part negative. You'll see what I mean here in a bit. The first part of it is the absence of Kevin Williamson. It's definitely noticeable here. So by now, this is pretty well-known knowledge, and if you're not aware of this story, there are plenty of other YouTube videos that have gone more in depth, but basically, Williamson had initially written a script for this film, but because of Columbine, studios were being heavily censored and had to avoid any strong violence in their films, especially violence involving schools and children, so his script got tossed. So they brought in a new writer, and while I would say we still got a pretty solid movie, I'll be forever curious what this film and this franchise as a whole would have looked like if they had stuck to his original script. I've never been a gorehound, but this movie almost felt like it could have been a straight-to-television movie. It was just very tame, even by Scream standards. I say that because Scream has never really been known for having the most creativity in its kills, but this movie was even less than that. In fact, if there wasn't the occasional F-bomb, I'd be surprised if this movie would have even gotten an R rating. But my last and final negative, and probably the most egregious and offensive thing in this movie... Yeah, that happened. But I stand by what I always say, guys. Compared to the low points of some other franchises, this movie still comes in looking like a freaking masterpiece. I appreciate everything this movie at least tried to do, and I think a lot of the things it did right were actually done really good. So for a rating, I'm giving this movie a 7.5. But if you agreed with anything I said, or even if you disagreed with anything I said, go ahead and let me know down in the comments section, or find me on one of my socials, which are always linked in my video descriptions, and we can discuss it. Also, go ahead and like and share this video, and if you haven't already, please subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.